The First Folio is the usual name for the book published in 1623 as Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories and Tragedies. It was the first publication to collect together the dramatic works of Shakespeare. Half of the plays between its covers had previously been published in single quarto editions. The other half were being published for the first time. This handsome folio volume, dedicated to William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke, and his brother Philip, Earl of Montgomery, was fronted by two letters, one to the noble dedicatees, one to the readers, by John Hemming and Henry Condell of the King's Men. The prefatory material also included an engraved portrait of the author, 2 poems by Ben Jonson, and 3 further poems by less famous writers, Hugh Holland, Leonard Digges, and someone calling themselves I.M., thought to be James Mabb. I and J were interchangeable at this time. Published 7 years after William Shakespeare's death, the First Folio is the earliest datable document that seems to connect the author to Stratford-upon-Avon. Not that it does so in a direct manner. The words Stratford and Avon appear in 2 separate poems. For many orthodox scholars, these references are clinching proof that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon wrote the plays that follow. Ben Jonson, they argue, knew Shakespeare personally, and Leonard Digges, one of the poets of the preface, was the stepson of Thomas Russell, who lived just outside Stratford-upon-Avon and oversaw Shakespeare's will. We'll look into that claim more closely in this section of the course. Ben Jonson's folio poems to and about Shakespeare are particularly important to study. Jonson's relationship with Shakespeare, or Shakespeare, is decidedly ambiguous, as you may have guessed from our brief look at his character Insulso Sogliardo. In essence, the slippery nature of texts, let alone Elizabethan texts, let alone poetry, mean that the First Folio is not the clinching proof of authorship that some people believe it to be. Jonson may be more important to the First Folio, and indeed the wider authorship question, than the poems in the preface. Jonson's biographer David Riggs has argued persuasively for Jonson being the editor of the First Folio. The First Folio follows the same methods of punctuation that Jonson used in his own works, instead of that of previously published quarto editions. In addition, according to Riggs, the extensive use of parentheses, semicolons and end-stop lines in the 1623 folio owes more to Jonson's example than to Shakespeare's habits of composition. It has even been suggested that Jonson wrote the letters attributed to Hemming and Condell, which launched the volume. Early critic George Steevens noted that the letter had much of the manner of Ben Jonson, and after studying it further stated, "I do not hesitate now to assert that the greater part of it was written by him." Evidence to support Jonson's being the editor of the First Folio includes the fact that in his private notebooks he derided as ridiculous a particular line of Julius Caesar, a line which has been silently corrected in the folio. And of all the contributors to the volume, it is Jonson's 2 poems, the poem facing the engraving and the 2-page eulogy, which have been given the most prominence. As we have come to expect from Jonson, they are not straightforward. Before we move on to the texts in the First Folio preface, it's useful to have a little more context about Jonson's seemingly two-faced relationship with Shakespeare. Jonson was the most successful satirist of his age. His stock in trade was the veiled reference and the double meaning. As a man who had been jailed for his writing and had spies set upon him while in prison, he knew the defensive value of language that works on a number of levels. As a satirist writing under a repressive regime, he had developed the self-preservational qualities of ambiguity and deniability on all subjects, whether they were immediately and obviously dangerous or not. Perhaps he was inconsistent about Shakespeare for all the usual reasons that people become hypocrites, spouting one set of opinions in private and another in public. He wanted to remain in favour with the powers that be. In 1618, Jonson told Sir William Drummond that Shakespeare wanted art. which suggests he thought Shakespeare lacked study in the art and craft of writing. But 5 years later, in the main Folio poem, Jonson praised him extremely, calling him soul of the age and star of poets. If one holds the orthodox line, Jonson is simply two-faced. But he addresses his Folio eulogy to Shakespeare with a seemingly pointed, capitalised, larger font qualifier. To the author, William Shakespeare. Why make so much of the words the author? It is perfectly possible to read Jonson as making a distinction between this man, the author of the works contained within, and the broker Shakespeare, who many scholars argue he lampooned in the character of Insulso Sogliardo, and non-Stratfordians believe was his poet ape. Jonson arguably made another distinction. The cast lists in Jonson's works, a large folio edition which he carefully edited and published in the year of Shakespeare's death, lists William Shakespeare as a principal actor in 2 of his plays. One should recognise that even from the perspective of orthodox scholars, these cast lists are not exactly truthful. We have no evidence to corroborate that Shakespeare was ever the principal actor in anything. Then as now, principal actors were noticeable and remarked upon. No one ever remarked on Shakespeare's acting, and scholars generally concur that if he took on acting roles, they were very small ones. So why would Jonson list him as a principal actor, with his name, along with that of Richard Burbage, topping these lists? Some non-Stratfordians feel it is significant that Jonson spells the name differently in the 2 lists. Jonson has a Will Shakespeare as principal comedian in Every Man Out of His Humour, but a hyphenated Will Shake-Speare as principal tragedian in Sejanus. Given Jonson's reputation for taking meticulous care in the presentation of his texts, and given that hyphenation is not explained by the requirements of font or layout, one may read the 2 forms of the name as deliberately distinct. Does the hyphenated form stand for the author beneath a pseudonym? It would be, one might imagine, a tragedy for an author not to be able to lay claim to his works of genius, making him indeed a principal tragedian. Does the unhyphenated form stand for Shakespeare of Stratford, the broker, and front? Giving him the title of principal comedian would fit with the depiction of Sogliardo as a clown and Drayton's focus on his comic vein. As you've learned, we can't argue that hyphenating a name means that it is automatically a pseudonym. But when the 2 different forms arise in these 2 contexts under the hand of a man as precise and as wily as Jonson, it certainly raises a question or 2. I hope you'll have a few more questions by the end of this module.